Welcome back to the Living Jewish Kitzur Shulchan Aruch class. We are in section 76 of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. We've spoken about starting davening early on a Friday afternoon to bring Shabbos in early. We spoke about the Friday night service. We spoke about Shabbos morning, starting a little bit later to get a little bit more sleep. We spoke about special inserts, the time for davening Shachris and Musaf and Mincha. We're now going to talk about the special Kedusha recited by the repetition of the Musaf prayer. Halacha 13. Let's take a look. So as we know, we always daven the silent Amidah first, and then there is the repetition of the Chazan. And during the repetition, we have that special prayer of Kedusha, where we declare the greatness and the holiness of Hashem. On a regular day, it's fairly short. On the Musaf of Shabbos is added inserts. Interestingly, one of the reasons why we add the Shema prayer in the middle of the repetition of the Amidah Musaf is because there was a time where the authorities did not allow the Jewish people to declare God as one. And since they weren't able to do it in the regular place of davening, they squeezed it in an unnoticed place, which was during the repetition of the Amidah. There are other reasons as well for this, but what he does point out is, when you look at that special prayer in the repetition of the Amidah, so we say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And then we continue, Hu Elokeinu, Hu Avinu. So here Israel, God is our God, God is one, and then we continue, He is our God, etc. Now he says some people would read Echad Hu Elokeinu, one is our God, but that's incorrect because the word one only comes at the end of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, God is one, and then we move straight on to saying He is our God. We don't say one is our God again. We don't say one twice in a row, because then that could be problematic, because then somebody might think we're talking about two ones. God forbid. Well, obviously we believe in only one God. The Hazdan, on the other hand, so he could start. He says Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu. We can start together with the community and then pause, and then repeats the second part after the community. And so he could start Echad Hu Elokeinu because he's not repeating the word Echad twice. Rather, it's just that's where he paused before he kicked in to repeat what the community had just sung. So that's an interesting note regarding the repetition of the Musaf prayer. Moving on to Shabbos afternoon, when it comes time for Mincha. So just before we read the Torah on Shabbos afternoon, so we have an interesting insert, a verse. It says, but as for me, may my prayer, etc., be in an auspicious time before you, Hashem. Why do we add this? Why do we speak about let my prayer be an auspicious one before you, Hashem, in an auspicious time? So it's based on what the sages of the Medrash explained. So King David says in Tehillim, they talk of me, those who sit at the gate, and about me are the songs of the drunkards. What was David HaMelech saying? That the songs of the drunkards are about Hashem. And then he continues, but as for me, may my prayer, etc. King David said before the Holy One blessed the sea, Master of the universe, this nation is not like other nations of the world. Other nations of the world, when they drink, they get drunk, and they become boisterous. And immediately thereafter it is written, but we are not like that. For even though we drink, we say, but as for me, may my prayer, etc. In other words, even after having a good festive Shabbos meal and maybe even saying L'chaim, we don't lose it. On the contrary, after a long Shabbos meal, we still make it back to Shul on a Shabbos afternoon in order to hear from the Torah. Therefore, this verse is recited before the reading of the Torah to give thanks to our Creator that He has not assigned our portion like theirs. For even the ignorant Tamagas come to hear the reading of the Torah on the Shabbos afternoon, meaning not just the sages, but even the commoner. So as opposed to like people often draw the contrast between the New Year's, secular New Year's, and the Jewish New Year's, and the stark contrast, both are days of festivity, but obviously our festivities are filled with so much more meaning and purpose. So too, we say Hashem after a whole day of having a festive meal, we're back in shul to be able to hear the Torah being recited. In fact, we say this line before the Torah reading. Also, if there is no Torah reading, if for whatever reason there was no Torah, and there was not a Torah reading on Shabbos afternoon, which there should be, but if for whatever reason there wasn't, we still would say this line, So that's an interesting insert that comes in the beginning of the Mincha prayer on Shabbos afternoon. And then there's another interesting insert. So he says, we say that anytime the Torah would be read, it should be Shabbos afternoon. And then there's another insert. That is just before we conclude the Mincha prayer, before we say Aleinu, there are these three verses. It's Kascha Tzedek La'elam, Sarascha Emes, your righteousness. So these three verses correspond to three righteous people that passed away all on Shabbos afternoon. Who were they? They were Yosef, Joseph, one of the brothers, Moshe, Moses, and King David. Since all these three passed away on a Shabbos afternoon, so we remember them by saying these three verses of Sikas Tzedek, of Tziduk Hadin. Now, if it's Shabbos is on a day where Tachdun would not be said, like let's say Shabbos was on Rosh Chodesh, for example, like I think it is this Shabbos, then maybe not, maybe Friday. I think so. Then we wouldn't say it's a custom because on a more joyful day, we don't do Tziduk Hadin, which is associated with the passing of people. But if it's in the house of a mourner, although one does not say Tachdun, in the house of a mourner, one would say this because otherwise on Shabbos you would be paying attention to the fact that there's a mourner, and you don't want to pay attention. You don't want to go into any form of mourning on Shabbos. So we would do it just like any other Shabbos, so as not to make a distinction. Here's another interesting halacha, and that is if it was Shabbos, but by mistake you started the Amidah, instead of doing the Shabbos Amidah, you started a weekday Amidah. So the beginning is the same. The first three blessings are the same every Amidah of the year, besides for slight changes around Rosh Hashanah time. So you started the first three blessings as usual. And when it came time for the fourth blessing, instead of making the blessing in line with Shabbos, you started a weekday blessing. Asking Hashem for wisdom, for healing, for sustenance. So he says that if you've already started a weekday blessing, then continue that blessing. And then after that, move on to Shabbos' blessing. Because in theory, we would be able to say those weekday blessings on Shabbos as well, as long as we insert a mention of Shabbos as well. But on Shabbos, we don't ask for all of our personal needs, and we don't want the davening, the Amidah, to be too long, to mention all of the weekday requirements as well as Shabbos. So on the Shabbos, we usually don't say weekday prayers, but if you started a weekday prayer, one of the weekday blessings in the middle of the Shabbos Amidah, then you do continue the one that you started until the end. If you only said the first word of the fourth blessing, so the first word of the fourth blessing is the same as the first word of the Shabbos blessing. So then you can still transition. It's Ata, you. Instead of saying Ata Chanen, Adam Da'at, instead of saying you give knowledge to a man, which is the weekday blessing, you would say Ata Kodesh, you are holy, which is for Shabbos. Or Ata Echad, on the Shabbos afternoon. That's halacha 17 as well. Okay. If, however, this happens in Shachris, so that was if it was the Ma'ariv prayer or the Mincha prayer that starts with the same word as the fourth blessing, Ata. If it happened to the Shabbos morning blessing, where on Shabbos we don't say Ata, So if you thought it was a weekday, then you got to finish that weekday blessing that you just started and then move on to the Shabbos Amidah. But if you knew it was Shabbos and you knew you're supposed to say Yismach Moshe, by mistake you said Ata, just because that's what you're used to doing, then you don't need to continue a weekday blessing because you actually didn't intend on saying it. Instead, you would just move straight into Shabbos prayer and say Yismach Moshe, which is what's said on the Shabbos morning. It's as if you just were saying the prayer for Shabbos, but for Shabbos afternoon instead of Shabbos morning, and that works. Okay, now, if you only realize that you were davening a weekday Shemona Esrei when you entered into the final 3 blessings that come at the end of the Amidah, so then you should stop wherever you are and go back to move across to the Siddur to the Shabbos Amidah and go from there. If you realize after you already said Yiyuler Atzon, which comes at the end of the Amidah, then it's too late to correct yourself, and it turns out that you did the wrong Amidah because you didn't mention Shabbos on the day of Shabbos, in which case you would actually repeat the Shemona Esrei. You would have an Amidah once again because the one that you did actually didn't qualify for that day. That's all if it's the evening prayer for Shabbos, the morning prayer for Shabbos, or the afternoon prayer for Shabbos. But if it's the 4th added Musaf prayer, and during your Musaf prayer, you started doing a weekday prayer instead of Shabbos, so even if you're in the middle of a blessing, then you stop wherever you are, because this prayer is not like a regular day. It's only there for Shabbos. So by mentioning weekday prayers, it's completely out. So there would be no reason to be mentioning the weekday under any circumstances. So therefore, if you realize in the middle of the Musaf prayer that but instead of doing the Shabbos or Yom Tov Musaf prayer, you're doing a weekday, you would stop wherever you realized and move across to the Shabbos Musaf from that 4th blessing, as long as you haven't yet finished. That said, if you do make a mistake and start the weekday Shemona Esrei and Shabbos, it is a bad omen for him. The fact that it's such a holy day called Shabbos, and you're still stuck in the mundane disturbances or stresses of the week, it means that you're not. The fact that you've kind of forgotten that it's Shabbos is not a good sign. And therefore, you should examine your deeds during the coming week and do teshuvah. It means that you're not in a good space. If on Shabbos you're busy moving into weekday mode, then it means that you're not in a good space, and you should think about this during the week and do teshuvah, so the following Shabbos you're as present as you should be. Okay, so now, until now we spoke about if on Shabbos you by mistake started davening a weekday Amidah. Here's a different scenario, and that is if you were busy davening the Shabbos Amidah, but you by mistake slipped from the one Shabbos prayer, from the one Shabbos Amidah to another Shabbos Amidah. Obviously, all of this won't happen if you look inside the Siddur, which is certainly what we should be doing. But if for whatever reason you weren't in the Siddur or you were in the Siddur in the wrong place, and you but during it's for example, it's Shabbos morning, it's Shachris prayer, and you're already saying Ata Kidashta, which is said on a Friday night, instead of saying Yismach Moshe, which is where the Shabbos morning middle prayer begins. So if you realize before you said Hashem's name at the end of the bracha, then you go back to the beginning of the bracha and you correct it. But if you only realize your mistake after you concluded that middle 4th bracha of the Amidah, then you should just conclude B'Kadesh HaShabbos, and you would have fulfilled your obligation, because as long as you've mentioned Shabbos and mentioned it being a day of rest, then you fulfilled your requirement. But the most important thing to mention when you do the Amidah on Shabbos is to mention Shabbos and that it's a day of rest. And all 3 of the Shabbos Amidahs, or all 4, mention that Shabbos is a day of rest. So if you mixed it up, if you're still in the middle, you could correct yourself. If you're already at the conclusion, you've already said Baruch Atah Hashem, which comes at the end of that 4th blessing, then you can leave it as is. Again, that's all for the regular. Those are for the 3 prayers that we would say every day: evening, morning, an afternoon, Shachas Milchamayim. But if it was the Musaf prayer, which is a unique prayer, then if you didn't mention the actual Musaf offering, meaning it was time to daven Musaf, and you by mistake daven Shachris for the second time, or Mayim for the second time, then you haven't fulfilled your obligation, and you would need to repeat it. Conversely, if you did the Musaf prayer during the evening, morning, or afternoon prayers, again, it was the wrong statement because you're not up to Musaf yet, and so you would need to repeat. So again, if you mixed up between Shachris and Chamayim, between the one Shabbos prayer and the other, after the fact, it's fine. But if you mixed up Musaf with another prayer, then you will need to repeat it. Finally, halacha 23, if you added the Yom Tov prayers, instead of concluding Mekadosh Yisrael Ba'azmanim, which is the way we conclude for Yom Tov, sanctify of Israel in the seasons, you concluded with Mekadosh HaShabbos, you mentioned Shabbos instead of Yom Tov. So if you corrected yourself immediately, like within a second or two, the amount of time it takes to say, hello, Rabbi, Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi, and you corrected yourself, then you fulfilled your obligation. If not, then you will need to go back and repeat that fourth blessing because you mentioned the wrong day. You mentioned Shabbos instead of Yom Tov. That brings us to the end of the laws relating to specifically the prayers of Shabbos. Next week, please God, we'll learn about the laws of making Kiddush on Shabbos and the meal, which are certainly very relevant to all of us.